Hi there, Amy here, coming on live today to talk about one of my favorite concepts or topics. It's the double-edged sword theory. And specifically, today we're going to talk about overgiving. We all have strengths that can sometimes show up as weaknesses. And the more aware we can become of our strengths that sometimes can hold us back, even to the same degree that they can often propel us forward, well, the more impact we can make. So we're going to jump in and talk about it today, starting with a question. And that is just inviting you to consider for yourself where one of your greatest strengths might actually be a double edged sword that is holding you back as a leader. And whether you are currently leading a team or you are leading your own life or professional life, there's going to be some takeaways in the video for you. So if you're curious, go ahead and stick around. I love working with leaders, and this is one of the reasons why, because leaders are so giving. They are generous with their time. A lot of high performing leaders are generous with their ideas, their availability, and how much they care about the success of others. Now, this is obviously a great strength that likely helped leaders succeed earlier in their careers. But however, over time, the same instinct to give more and more and more, to explain more, to do more, to carry more for others, it can start to limit our impact for ourselves that we can make, but also the impact that your team and others around you are able to make for themselves. So the question we're exploring today is, what if effective leadership is not about giving more, but instead about giving less, just more intentionally? And I was curious because this is a theme that has come up for me personally in my own life, overgiving, a pattern that I recognize for many years. And I've come a long way in overcoming this challenge in my personal life, but it still shows up here and there a little bit in my professional life, maybe in my personal life too. But so we're always works in progress. But anyhow, that's why this topic is coming up for me, because I noticed the pattern kind of show up again in my professional life this week. And I was curious if there's research out there that on leaders overgiving and how that behavior can challenge their leadership skills and abilities and teams rather. And it turns out there is a lot of research out there in organizational psychology and in leadership, and it does show that the consistent pattern that when leaders overgive in ways including over communicating, failing to set clear boundaries, and I'll share more specifics on what I mean by that as we get into the video, but teams don't become more empowered. Instead, they become more dependent and even can feel more overwhelmed because they can feel less confident in making decisions on their own. So sometimes by helping too much, we can, rather than empower, disempower, of course, unintentionally, our team members and or those around us. The research shows, however, that leaders who simplify their communication, and I'll get into what I mean by that, and clarify their expectations and set healthier boundaries, end up having higher engagement from their team and better decision making from their team, and of course less burnout, both for themselves and their team. So when I say, what if, we think about or consider giving less, I'm not talking about becoming distant or uncaring or less supportive, but instead about how clarity can work to actually empower more than overgiving. And so we're going to dive in, and I'll share some specific real world examples. We'll talk a little bit more about what the research shows, and then I'll leave you with some takeaways, some action steps that you can start practicing today and work to elevate your impact and the impact that you are, the impact of the folks on your team and others in your life if you're not leading a team. All right, let's go ahead and dive in here. I actually want to start with the why. I always like to dig a little bit deeper, go a couple layers deeper, and consider why we're doing what we're doing or not doing what we're doing, and why these patterns can show up. And a lot of times, overgiving patterns can stem from fear that, for me, I started this pattern as a kid. We can have We all have family dynamics, sometimes great, sometimes not so great, sometimes indifferent, but they shape our behaviors when we're younger. And then, if left unchecked, if not full, when we don't fully understand what we're doing or not doing, the behavior and how it's impacting us, then we just carry forward the behavior. So I did a lot of overgiving as a kid, and then I carried that into my adult life. So where did it come from for me? Fear of bothering others, fear of doing something wrong. I don't want to bother anybody. I don't want to mess anything up. And the positive there is caring for others and wanting to help others. But where is this also holding me back? So whether overgiving can be a challenge for you, or if there's a different challenge, you can think back to, well, how long have I been doing this pattern? And maybe it served me at some point, but is it still serving me now? Because these patterns that we developed in childhood to as a survival mechanism, survival is a strong word, but it's just what we do as kids, because we have to figure out we have to make decisions, and we have to figure out how to do things. And we're not as equipped, of course, when we're younger with the tools that we are now equipped with as adults. So these patterns over time, if we don't go back and work to overcome them and make some shifts, they can erode our confidence, especially over giving, and our self-respect over time. If we're giving too much, we're not establishing clear boundaries, we are limiting our own time that we can and focus toward what it feels meaningful to us. So then we're limiting our impact. But instead, by clarifying your values and what is important and meaningful for you to focus on, well, then you can and then create greater discipline around these boundaries, and you're going to restore the impact that you are meant to make. And in doing so, you're going to help your team do the same. So this is we're talking about overgiving, but you can take and apply what we're talking about today to any pattern that you observe in your life, personal and professional, that is potentially holding you back. So let's look at some real world examples. I want to bring up the example of a leader that I worked with years back. So now I work for myself, but this was when I was working for an organization. And being that I was new in the organization, there was this pattern showing up again where I didn't want to mess anything up. I didn't want to step on anybody's toes. I didn't want to bother anybody. I wanted to make sure that I was doing the right thing. And so I was reaching out to the leader, my manager, with questions here and there in the beginning. And he said to me in the kindest, most encouraging way, but he was establishing a boundary, but it was in a nice, uplifting, genuine, caring way. He said, "You're not going to break anything. Go ahead and make a decision." So this is an example of establishing a boundary of, instead of coming to him with all of my questions, you answer your own questions, you go figure it out. And he even said to me, "I trust you. I have full confidence in you. I know you can do it." And it made me feel really good. And his confidence in me, well, what it did for him is it gave him some time back, because if your team is coming to you with questions that they could be answering for themselves, well, it's distracting your focus. And so it's pulling you from your higher level strategic focus that you need to be working on. That's why you're in your leadership role. And it's also disempowering your team because they're not thinking for themselves. And so he freed up some of his time to keep his focus on what he was focusing on, and he empowered me at the same time. I felt more confident. I took ownership. I learned more. Maybe I did step on toes occasionally, but it wasn't my intention and it wasn't a problem. I didn't bother anybody. So it freed up his bandwidth, creating this boundary, and it instilled greater confidence in me. Another example was a leader that I worked with as a client, and his team loved him, and but he was feeling burnt out. He was really feeling overworked and overwhelmed. And he shared with me that he was confused because his team, when he interviewed them, they had the experience, they had the skill sets, they were qualified to do the role, but the different tasks are required. But they kept coming to him for the answers for how to do this and how to do that. So the communication kept flowing upward to him. So he was stepping in and making the decisions for his team. And the result was he was over functioning and he was really stressed out. This actually led to him working 14-hour days. And then he didn't even have the bandwidth or wasn't able to see how to get the bandwidth to resolve the situation. So this is an example when your team is coming to you with, and you're making the decisions for them. Well, it disempowers a team. Again, his team loved him, loved working with him. He wasn't making them intentionally, or they probably were not even aware that they were maybe feeling a bit disempowered. But if you're continuously going to somebody else for an answer that you could figure out on your own, of course, it's limiting your own impact as an individual contributor. And I'll share one more example, and then we'll jump into the research and the takeaways. When leaders don't establish clear expectations, this is a consistent communication challenge that I notice a lot. We may have a vision in our minds of what we want for the deliverable, but if we don't articulate it clearly enough, well, then this can diminish the confidence of our team to complete the task, because they may not understand exactly the deliverable that the leader is looking for. So this can create employee paralysis, and then sometimes even the leader can get frustrated or on that the deliverables are not being met or not in the right time, and they might then step in and do the work, and then this is going to erode the confidence of the employee. But when you instead a better option would be to set the clear expectation of the deliverable. This is what I'm looking for. And then put that trust in the process back in the employee. You could say to your employee, you're the expert in this area. You got this. However you want to get there, I trust you. If you need a resource or want to bounce ideas, I'm here. But here's what we're looking for. And however you get there, you got it, you go for it. And that type of communication would be more likely to empower the employee, and then they're going to take ownership. Because whenever we're doing the doing for somebody else, they can't take ownership. And then when we don't have ownership and autonomy, I'm sure you can probably relate to some personal experiences, personal or professional life. And the research also shows as well, we're not as motivated. So to be intrinsically motivated, we need some sense of ownership and some sense of autonomy in order to be motivated and have the confidence to do the work. So let's dive into the research now. I mentioned boundaries before, and boundaries, when we think about setting boundaries, sometimes that can feel a little uncomfortable, or we think that it's going to feel uncomfortable, but it doesn't always have to be a harsh boundary. For the example that I gave earlier, where my manager said to me, go ahead and make a decision. You got this. I trust you. You're not going to mess anything up. You're not going to break anything. This was him setting a boundary of me not coming to him for all of my questions. I can figure it out on my own. And again, it was very direct communication, but it was also gentle and encouraging and empowering. Sometimes setting boundaries absolutely can feel and be uncomfortable. Whenever I first started writing my first book, I carved out a 3-hour writing block. This is my time block where I'm doing my writing, and I let people in my life know I'm not available at this time. And maybe some of the people in my life were not in particular at that time working toward a goal. So they didn't maybe understand why that was important to me. And so they would try to cross the boundary by calling me at that time, by asking me to get together, trying to get my time during that time that I had already established that boundary. So yes, sometimes there can be some friction in establishing a boundary, but remember, the best way to help others is to make the impact that is meant for you to make. So if as a leader, again, in your own life and or leading a team, if you don't have a boundary around what you're available for, what you can help with, and when, well, then your boundaries are going to be crossed. And then you're also decreasing disempowering rather your team members. And the research shows that by establishing these clear boundaries, you help your team to increase ownership and engagement. when we have to do things ourselves, of course, we're more engaged. And the research also shows that, of course, this is obvious, but poor delegation contributes to burnout. So that's the example that I gave earlier, where the leader was over functioning, working 14-hour days, doing the doing and answering the questions and coming up with the ideas for his team. And that's another thing that the research talks about is decision fatigue. This is going to happen more when the decisions are flowing upward rather than offloading some of the decisions that your team is capable of to your team. Another thing the research talked about is over-explaining and relating over-explaining to psychological safety. So I've seen this in group dynamics, and I'll be honest, it really annoys me when I'm not a fan of metaphors. I like just direct communication. Just give me the information. And if I have a question, I'm going to ask a clarifying question if I don't understand. And you want to empower your team with that behavior by demonstrating that behavior yourself. And then if so, you want to just share clear and specific information, communication, but we don't need to over explain and explain in multiple different ways, because it eats up time. Your conscientious employees that already got it the first time and are ready to get to their next task, they don't need the information explained again. So just explain clear and specific, and then stop and encourage your team to ask clarifying questions. This is also going to help. This is where the research was talking about psychological safety, helping your team feel safe to speak up, to challenge, to ask questions, those clarifying questions. So we talked about some personal examples and what the research shows, and why we can sometimes have these patterns. And there's a lot of power and self-empowerment in just bringing awareness to behaviors that are not serving us. Of course, we can't solve a problem that we don't know is showing up. And when you can dig a little bit deeper to understand the why behind the behavior, well, this really creates an opportunity then to make a different choice moving forward. And often these behaviors are carried over, rooted early in conditioning out of fear. And if it's overgiving, maybe fear of conflict, maybe a desire to be helpful. But again, these patterns were once, if overgiving is a pattern for you, or maybe it's a different pattern that you're recognizing in yourself, they once served their purpose when we were younger, helping us to survive. But now we're older, we're experienced, we're better equipped to make some new choices. And there's no shame in having challenges. It's all about just we're all works in progress. And as a leader, you want to make your impact. And part of your role as a leader is to help your team make their impact. So hopefully what we talked about today is helpful, and something for you to think about moving forward. So let's talk about that now. Some quick takeaways and action steps that you can start applying today and or this week. You can choose one of these or try each of them over time and think about what action steps you can take to work toward overcoming any behaviors that sometimes are a strength, but sometimes they show up as a weakness in an area that is potentially holding you back. So consider where you could do less to actually create more impact. Where could you maybe delegate one decision fully to your team members? Where can you set one clearer boundary? And this is great to practice, setting boundaries in personal life and professional life. And it can feel uncomfortable at first because we've got that fear there, especially if you're like me, you don't want to bother anybody, you want to help people. But I've gotten very good at setting boundaries. It was something that I definitely had to do in working for myself. This is one boundary crossing thing that I've noticed a lot in working for myself and working from home. Friends, family will often say to me, "Oh, but you work for yourself," when we're trying to make plans, for example, meaning, well, I can just shift whatever I had planned and be flexible. I've gotten that a lot too, be flexible. But, I used to explain, well, actually working for myself, working from home means I actually need to be a lot more disciplined, but I don't explain anymore. because I've worked to establish that boundary. I'm confident in it because I know that the more I prioritize and focus what is meaningful to me, well, that's how I can make my greatest impact. And the same is true for you too. So whether you're working toward a goal that is important for you to achieve, working toward those bigger overarching goals as you're leading your team, you have your priorities that you're focusing on for a reason. And the more time that you have to focus by creating those boundaries, well, the better and faster you're going to make your impact. And then you are leading by example, demonstrating that with how to set a boundary and the boundaries that you've set, and then others can see that and maybe do the same for themselves. And then also another thing that you can do is see where you can simplify communication. So for example, in the over functioning leader example that I gave earlier, a lot of the questions and communication from his team were flowing upward. So he was making all of the decisions. Well, where can you offload some of those decisions by making the communication simpler? So team, you don't have to come to me for this decision. You got this. So I'm sure you wouldn't say it exactly like that, but you get the idea. So a couple things that you can do this week: observe one area where you might be overgiving, and then work to make one intentional change. And then notice what happens. So you can pick one of the examples that I gave above. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions. If you're watching the replay, I will definitely come back to any comments or questions. If you want to reach out and talk through a leadership challenge or an example that you have, I would love to hear from you. There are links in the description to get in touch with me. And just I'll leave you with this: your job as a leader and as a professional is not to carry everything. This was a hard lesson for me to learn. So if it's hard for you, I absolutely understand. But in our work as humans, as leaders, is to instead create clarity, to help our team trust themselves by building that trust with them. And ultimately, leadership is about creating space so that others can rise. I love working with leaders, so they often tell me that one of the reasons they decided to pursue leadership is because they really enjoy seeing and helping others succeed. And we can do that more by putting into practice some of the exercises and takeaways that I left you with. So thank you for watching. I hope that you got some value from the video. If you did, I invite you to like and subscribe. Reach out. There are links in the description to connect if you'd like to do that. And I'll see you in the next one.